So the White House just announced a $5 billion AI for Science initiative. It was on July 22nd of this year. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the OSTP, announced more than $5 billion in federal commitments to expand the Genesis mission. That's the Trump administration's National AI for Science initiative. The announcement was made by Michael Kratzios. He serves as the assistant to the president for science and technology and director of the OSTP. So that seems to make sense. Like, take the activities that happen in science today and apply artificial intelligence to those activities, right? We're using AI. We know how advanced it's getting. Why not apply that to science? True, but the activities in science are not all productive. Today's science is brutally reductionist in that it looks to peel back the layers, analyze individual pieces, and then operate under the assumption that knowledge of how the pieces work lead to knowledge and applications of how nature and technology actually function. While this has been quite successful historically, many of today's frontier problems look fundamentally different. They don't really arise because we don't understand the individual components. They arise because we don't fully understand how enormous numbers of components interact. So in other words, I'm going to argue in this episode that the remaining uncertainty that we look to solve as a human species, it's actually shifted from the parts to the relationships between the parts. And science as it is currently practiced is actually ill-suited for the problems that we now have. And as such, placing AI into the existing scientific paradigm is akin to placing a faster car on the wrong road. It doesn't get you to the destination any faster. In fact, it takes you away from it faster. I'm not saying all of science today is going wrong. Of course, it's not. There's a lot of great success there. The scientific method still stands, but there's a reductionist, overly simplistic view of the way that we peel back the layers, look for the individual pieces, and think that the knowledge of the individual pieces is going to get us what we want down the road. If you take a look at the problems that we're facing now in what I would call the age of complexity, that process doesn't really work that well. So I'm going to start with a discussion on how the scientific method works today, its steps. Then we'll see how it looks to place AI inside those steps to supercharge science as it's practiced today. But then I'll show you how that doesn't really attack the problems we have today and argue for a more system-level approach to using AI in science. So yes, money to science. Yes, artificial intelligence for use in science. Fund it. But I think the approach needs to change in how we go about actually doing science today. So, what is this kind of scientific method? Let's just go through the steps, right? Obviously, we've got things happening in reality, right? We have phenomena that we observe, and we want to take a look at evidence against that, right? So we're taking a look at phenomena. We want evidence that something is going to happen. Even just think of it as casual observation at first. But then we arrive at hypotheses where we take an educated guess about what we think is happening. We do a prediction, we run an experiment, and then we update our understanding. And that whole thing essentially just operates in a loop. We do it again and again. So for example, let's say the reality is that a disease exists. Patients experience inflammation, pain, or cancer. The evidence is, scientists measure biomarkers, gene expression, protein levels, patient outcomes, imaging, whatever. Then you have a hypothesis, like protein X is causing the disease. If we inhibit protein X, symptoms should improve. Prediction, a drug that blocks protein X should reduce disease severity. Do the experiment, cell cultures, animal studies, clinical trials, and then you update your understanding, right? Sometimes the drug works, often it partially works, sometimes it fails completely, sometimes it just creates serious side effects, and then you loop it, right? Scientists revise their understanding and try again. Okay, so is this really the way it works, and how does that stand up against the problems that we have today? Well, many of today's frontier problems actually look fundamentally different than they have over the last, let's say, couple hundred years. They don't really arise because we don't understand the individual components. They arise because we don't fully understand how enormous numbers of components interact. Let me give you some examples. Let's say we're talking about pharmaceuticals. We know an enormous amount about individual receptors and signaling pathways, right? Great science has been done here. But the challenge isn't usually identifying another receptor anymore. It's more like predicting how changing one part of a regulatory network will propagate throughout the entire organism. So let me give you a more specific example of this. For decades, Alzheimer's research focused on amyloid beta plaques, as they call them. And they focused on that as the primary cause of the disease. In fact, billions of dollars were invested in drugs specifically designed to remove amyloid. And many successfully did, actually. They did just that. But reducing amyloid often produced only modest clinical improvements, if anything, suggesting that Alzheimer's is not simply a disease of one protein, but an interacting system involving inflammation, vascular health, metabolism, genetics, aging. The challenge is no longer identifying another molecule. It's understanding how changing one part of the system propagates throughout the entire brain. It's a different thing. Let's use a neuroscience example. We know a tremendous amount about neurons. We still struggle to explain cognition, though. The mystery is increasingly in the organization and interaction of billions of neurons. So we understand individual neurons really, really well. There's the reductionist approach. Good science. It's interesting. What is a neuron? How does it work? What is its role in the brain? We know how they fire. We know how they communicate through synapses, right? And we know how they use neurotransmitters to transmit signals. But despite this detailed knowledge, we still cannot explain how consciousness, reasoning, memory, or intelligence emerge. The frontier is no longer the neuron itself, but it's the organization and interaction of billions of neurons operating together as a system. What about the climate? Right? The laws governing individual molecules are obviously well understood, but the challenge lies in the coupled dynamics of the atmosphere, oceans, biosphere, and human activity to actually get this right. So climate science is not limited to our understanding of the physics of the molecules, right? We know how greenhouse gases absorb radiation. That's a molecular reductionist view. And we know how fluids behave, which gets you a bit higher level, but still kind of very specific. But where does the difficulty in climate change actually come from? Well, it comes from coupling together the atmosphere, the oceans, the clouds, the vegetation, right? Ice sheets and human activity into one interacting system. So the uncertainty, like where does it lie? It lies in the feedback loops between these systems, not in the physics of the individual components. And this is why a lot of the climate change debate never really goes anywhere, because people keep pointing at very specific reductionist things, and then someone comes out with a different study or a different observation that says, well, actually, right, you're going to look at one blip of time where the pattern changed, but then you can say, yeah, but you've only been measuring over a couple hundred, or not even, maybe like 50 years. But in the, what about over 10,000 years? Maybe that's not really statistically significant. You look at a molecule and say it absorbs CO2 and there's lots of molecules, but what is a lot? Billions of tons relative to what? And you keep going back and forth and it kind of never really converges anywhere. Reductionism isn't going to answer the question. Looking at what molecules do and how they absorb and how much we're releasing into the atmosphere is not enough. It's a bigger interconnecting system. Where does the uncertainty lie? Feedback loops, various systems, right? Not in the physics of the individual components. What about economics, right? We understand how individuals make decisions, to the most part. We still struggle, though, to predict emergent market behavior, right? So economists have developed sophisticated models describing how individuals respond to incentives, prices, and information. Lots of rich theories out there and practical aspects of those theories. But markets continue to surprise us, right? With bubbles, crashes, cascading financial crises. Again, where's the challenge? Where's the uncertainty? It's not understanding a single consumer or business. It's understanding how millions of interacting decisions produce collective behavior that no individual intended. Even just artificial intelligence itself. We know what a transformer layer does, if you want to get into how today's AI technology functions, but we still don't understand how capabilities emerge from the interaction of dozens of layers and billions of parameters. So researchers, yes, they understand the individual building blocks of modern AI remarkably well. They know how they set up. They know the mathematics. We know how attention works, how transformer layers process information. We know how optimization updates billions of parameters during training, yet we still struggle to explain why the capabilities such as reasoning, planning, or abstraction suddenly emerge as models grow larger, and they do. We can observe it happening. So the mystery is increasingly found in the organization and interaction of billions of parameters rather than in any single component. So the main point I want to make in this episode is that we need to change our idea of what it means to understand something. Science is not bad. Science as a process is wonderful. Look at the nature objectively. Try to understand things rationally, logically, make observations, come up with explanations and models. Okay, good. That's all good stuff, right? Now, historically, so if we think about what the word understand means, historically, science has largely equated understanding with answering questions like this. What are the parts? How does each part work? What are the causal mechanisms? Can I derive the behavior of the whole from the behavior of the individual pieces? And that has been massively successful, right? But it implicitly assumes that understanding the parts is sufficient for understanding the whole. And again, going to the example challenges and so many more that I've given you, many modern systems and problems suggest something different. You can know almost everything about the components and still fail to predict the system. Why? Because the important information is increasingly stored in interactions, constraints, organization, feedback, adaptation, emergence writ large, right? In fact, the idea that prediction is even the thing to go after is highly suspect. Traditionally, it made sense, but for complex adaptive systems, which is where today's problems are sitting, it's much too narrow, right? So, okay, what can the word understanding mean? Understanding can mean prediction, right? Can I accurately forecast the future state? This is kind of the physics gold standard. It can also mean control. Can I reliably steer the system? In fact, medicine often cares more about this than perfect prediction, right? Because we don't obviously fully predict the body, but we can often move it toward a healthier state, right? Again, with a lot of side effects. Explanation can be a type of understanding. Can I explain why the behavior occurs? I'm not trying to predict it, not necessarily trying to control it, but can I explain it? And this is where reductionism has traditionally excelled, but under complexity, reductionist explanations just fall dead at the doorstep. And then there's navigation, and this is the one I think is the critical type of understanding we need in the age of complexity, because, well, what is it? What do I mean by navigation? Think about it like these types of questions. Where the stable equilibria are. What kinds of interventions destabilize it? Which variables matter the most? What feedback loops exist? Which directions are safe versus dangerous? That's a different type of understanding. It's almost like understanding a landscape instead of a trajectory. So let's go back to those examples and see what they would look like under this new type of understanding that I'm promoting here. So, okay, I talked about pharmaceuticals. I said for decades, Alzheimer's research, again, they focused on the amyloid beta plaques. That was going to be the primary cause of the disease. Billions of dollars were invested, right, in drugs designed to remove the amyloid, and they did that successfully. And again, those improvements in cognition were either non-existent or extremely modest. So the field is increasingly recognizing that Alzheimer's as a disease involves interacting systems including inflammation, vascular health, metabolism, genetics, aging. So rather than searching for the next molecule to target, AI could help map the entire regulatory landscape, revealing which interventions move the brain toward healthier, more stable states while minimizing the unintended side effects. In other words, you're not trying to go for a specific target. You're not saying, here's the root cause of Alzheimer's. There's no such thing as a root cause in complex systems, right? The whole question is ill-posed when you say, what is the root cause? The causal web is massively distributed. It has no place to point at. You need to build an understanding of the regulatory landscape of the area. Understand which interventions move towards different type of equilibria that are more beneficial, that are healthier, that are more stable for a person with this condition, while minimizing the unintended side effects. So it's almost like a broader, right, landscape-driven understanding. And that is the type of understanding that, quite frankly, AI is particularly suited for, right? When it goes and recognizes a face, it doesn't do it because it adds up very specific distances between the eyes and the nose and the mouth and things like this. That old school rules-based approach never worked, never will. AI is this broader, kind of more all-encompassing landscape approach to pattern recognition, and that's how it actually works. So I don't think it's crazy to say that this is really how we should be directing AI towards today's challenges. Let's use neuroscience, right? I gave the example there. We understand the individual neurons. That's not really what it's about. Well, AI can help identify the large-scale network structures, right? Feedback loops and stable brain states that give rise to cognition, allowing us to navigate the landscape of possible brain activity rather than searching for a single intelligent neuron. It's not about the root cause. It's not like, where does intelligent come from? The whole question doesn't even make sense, right? It's not like that. That's not what emergent is. It's a landscape of massively interacting systems, interacting at a massive level. You have to do it more distributed, more holistic, and more the way pattern recognition works. That's what AI is good at. Build explanations around that, not reductionist type explanations that are ill-posed. I use the climate as an example, right? AI could help map the Earth's stability landscape, right? You could identify tipping points, resilient climate states, and various interventions that most likely steer the planet toward long-term stability. So it's not like this specific molecule, let's say released into the atmosphere at this specific amount, and now we're going to come up with guidelines. It's just too reductionist. It's not real, right? But having these broader patterns that get recognized and what is stable and what is not, and how do systems like this that are analogous outside climate, right? Similar systems act, and what do we know about them? What are the fundamental properties, right? That is actually a more scientific way to approach it. And reductionism always takes you away from that more scientific approach. Economics, AI could help identify fragile market configurations, systemic risks, resilient economic structures. That kind of stuff would allow policymakers to navigate the economy instead of merely reacting to it, right? With very specific levers that supposedly make changes that they don't really make. And then again, AI itself. Well, AI itself may become one of the best tools for understanding these organizational principles. Like I said, it can help us map the landscape of intelligence instead of searching for the neuron or layer where intelligence lives. And we can apply this to AI itself at the meta level, right? Think about different AI agents instead of relying on one. Thinking of intelligence as being localized inside the quote-unquote skull of an individual AI agent, you have many agents interacting, and you get into this kind of meta voting, almost debating scenario that produces much better results, and we're already seeing some of that. So in all cases, we now look for where the stable equilibria are, what kinds of interventions destabilize it, not do something specific, but destabilize it. Which variables matter the most, not the specific level, not the specific, like, if I just crank this up, it's going to be better, but which ones matter? What feedback loops exist? Which directions are safe versus dangerous? It's a different kind of understanding, and arguably the one we need to use if AI is going to be applied successfully to science. $5 billion? Awesome. I love it. I love the initiative. I like it. Apply AI to science? Absolutely. But we got to do it correctly. Let's use it wisely. We're entering a new world. The problems that we face are not really amenable to such reductionism. I don't think the current reductionist paradigm is going to extend into the problems that we need to solve now successfully. Let's reframe the where the actual uncertainty lives. Let's reframe how we understand understanding, and let's use AI as a tool directed in that fashion, because that's what it's particularly good at anyways. I think that would be a much better way to spend the $5 billion with this new initiative and using AI in science writ large. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode. And for those of you who are watching, until the next one, take care.